Welcome back to the Shared Practices podcast. This is great to have a new legal perspective on the show. So we've got with us Rob Montgomery. He is a dental lawyer, and he's very much declared himself to be and has a lot of clout and respect from people that I've talked with online, and his name just kept coming up over and over and over. So I knew we had to have him on the show. So this set of episodes, we're going to do acquisitions first, and get kind of the legal how and when to hire a lawyer in an acquisition, and then also the real estate. I feel like is just another fundamental perspective. We've covered some of these things from different angles, but I really liked the perspective that he brought to the table. So to say before we get into this interview?
I'm just going to echo what you said. I think Rob is a fantastic. I talked to him extensively on the phone, and I had him. He's actually one of the guest lecturers of the Ownership Accelerator, and he kills it in the Accelerator, and nothing different in the interviews. These two interviews, I think you guys are really going to enjoy them.
Awesome. Okay, here we go. Okay, welcome back to the podcast. We have today with us Robert Montgomery. Rob, you've been on the show with Jamie Amos and Paul Goodman before. I had the opportunity to talk with you before that episode and a little bit afterwards. I really wanted to get you on with your specific background of dental law and the fact that you've done hundreds and hundreds over the years. And it seems like your firm is based in Pennsylvania. Is that correct? But then you've got different offices and locations all over the U.S. Is that right?
That's correct, Richard. We are mainly, we're headquartered in Philadelphia, and that's where we work. Some satellite offices. We also have lawyers that work from other locations around the country or licensed in various states. So we do work for dentists all around the country. There are a few places that we're not involved, but we do a lot of work for dentists in different places outside of Philadelphia as well. Yeah.
Well, and I love the fact that like you've committed, you're all in, because your website is yourdentallawyer.com, which is, you can't really be like a dental lawyer and like a bunch of other types of lawyers with that website. So I appreciate the fact that right up front, your website is letting everyone know, like, this is what we do.
We are what we are. There's no, for better or for worse, there's no way around it. So we might as well, acknowledge that. And that's why we have that URL.
That's great. And that I love about that is that just like with anything in dentistry, volume proficiency is really what's going to get, in my mind, the best result. And that's like, I'm in a weird circumstance right now in the Army where I'm doing a residency where I'm doing a little bit of and I'm learning procedures in all the specialties. The hard part about that is that it's hard to get really good at all of these different procedures if you're not doing them over and over and over and over. And so I feel constantly like, oh, wow, okay, I want to be doing more of this. And then I want to be doing more of that. Put yourself in a circumstance where you do transitions and real estate for dentists. And you've done this over and over and over, and you have systems. You've seen the problems and the issues. And so you bring a lot of experience to the table. So what I want to get from you today is your perspective and your experience on transitions and how things can go wrong and how things can go right if you do it right and you know what you're doing up front with hiring an attorney and having things and having the right expectations and the right agreements up front. So I'm really excited for this because this is a different perspective that we haven't had on the show. So thank you for being willing to come on the show today.
Great. Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
So the first thing I want to talk about right up front, it's been a sticky issue for some people that I've known in the past, is compensation with an attorney. So I've seen people put out there like, okay, it's going to be this much to do your transition, and we're going to do this, this, and this. We're going to help you with the valuation, with negotiation things, and we're going to do all your contract review and submitting an LOI and all of this. And then there's a big fee associated with that. And you kind of think like, is that a fair fee? Do I know how much I should be paying? This is the first time I've hired a lawyer and the best representation. I don't want to overpay. It's a difficult situation to know what's fair and what's good and what's normal. So talk to me about this idea of a fixed fee for a transition versus like hourly for the time and attention you're paying to a project.
Sure. So we don't do fixed fee or flat fee arrangements.
Okay.
We bill hourly for the work that we do. And I don't think that flat fees are appropriate in this context with dental transitions or even lease reviews and negotiations for startups, whatever it may be. There are some things where you could do a flat fee to prepare certain documents. That's more or less rote type of work. Get into charging somebody in a fee arrangement for what's going to be a protracted process and negotiation. It's impossible to anticipate how long that's going to take. And so what happens with any kind of flat fee arrangement, you have to estimate a flat fee that's going to take into consideration that there could be problems that occur.
Okay.
And so you're going to estimate, sort of additional work that you may not need to do. So with that, step back for a second, there are several sort of instances where this is a bad thing. That's one of them, where a lawyer says, I don't know how the other lawyer is going to be to deal with. We don't know if they're going to have dental experience or be experienced in these things. We don't know if it's going to take 2 drafts of the agreement or 15 drafts of the agreement. So I'm going to build in a flat fee that assumes that we may have some issues because I don't want to lose money on this. So, or
some clients might be a little bit more needy in terms of time and attention and questions and emails, and some people are really easy to assure them, like, no, this is what we're doing, this is why we're doing it, and other people are going to require more time and attention and up front what kind of project it's going to be.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And so when you quote that flat fee, it actually sets up what I think is a failed relationship, because if either the flat fee higher than the amount of work that was actually done, in which case the lawyer wins,
yeah,
or it was too low, in which case the client, quote unquote, wins. So it sets up the situation in the attorney-client relationship and a loser. And in any relationship, whether it's a partnership, a marriage, attorney-client, when you have a winner and a loser, that's a relationship that's doomed to fail. And so we don't think that. And I think what it comes down to is when you hire a lawyer, you're hiring somebody to do what needs to be done to protect you in a transaction and to advise you and to guide you through the process. The amount of you're paying for to do that right. And we tell clients, when they ask us how much is it going to cost, we give them a range of fees of what it typically costs. And I say, I can tell you how much it costs for me to prepare a draft of an asset purchase agreement. That's easy. We hit that ball over the net, we have no idea what we're going to get back from the other side. And that's something that we may have to deal with. It may take a lot of time, it may take a little time. And from our perspective, if it takes a little bit of time, we want our clients to come away with the most efficient billing possible, the fairest price for the transaction to do the work that needed to be done, to get the deal done and to adequately protect them. And a lot of times there are misconceptions when dealing with lawyers that lawyers are trying to run up the fees and they're going to charge as much as possible. And I guess, there are lawyers that do that, but not all lawyers do that. Lawyers know their business and develop a practice over the long term to get referrals from other dentists. We want our clients to come away and say, hey, those guys were great. They provided a great service for us, and I feel like that was a fair fee. That's what we want doing, and that's how we get business. You could soak people, sure, if that's what you wanted to do, but don't expect to have many clients if you do that. So to me, the solution for that is work with somebody that is fair, and the best way to do that is go out, talk to colleagues who have worked with people and find out what their experience was like and get referrals for people that are trustworthy and that are fair. And then they're the people that you should go ahead and.
There's a couple things there. It seems to me that if you're doing a flat fee arrangement, you're now setting the lawyer up for the incentive is to work less. And the more time and effort goes into the project, the less they're getting paid to be working on this project because they've already been paid for the project. So you want the incentive to be that if there's things that need to be done, then we get them done. And if there's not, then we don't do that. And I actually found exactly what you just said, which was I got onto a rather large, I think it was on Dental Hacks is where I posted. And I kind of asked, hey, I'm looking for another attorney to recommend to people on the show and to have on the show who has had with a dental attorney on transitions, and like your name just like kept popping up. And I was like, okay, like after like the fifth person recommending Rob Montgomery, I'm like, okay, we're going to have him on the show. So it definitely goes to show that you've built that people respect both the work that you do and your fairness when it comes to billing and compensation and all of that. And it's kind of funny for me to start with this compensation point right up front, but it's an issue that I feel is important. How you have this relationship with your team of your lawyer, your CPA, your consultant, who you're going to have helping you, how that compensation is structured affects how the relationship goes. And so I appreciate and the way that you do things. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thanks, Richard, for that nice compliment too. And I think your point is an excellent one. And I think it sort of underlies, the bigger issue. What are you trying to do when you hire a lawyer? Are you out looking for a person to do the job, or are you looking for somebody to protect you and provide excellent service and make sure that everything is done correctly? And that's a decision that when you're going out to hire an attorney, you have to keep the goal here, and if you're trying to find the cheapest person possible to do it, you can find that. But is that really what you want at this crucial juncture of your professional career, whether you're doing an acquisition, a startup, whatever the case may be, a buy-in? Like, that's not the time to let's go out and try to do it ultra cheap and save as much money as possible. Why? Just protect yourself. That should be the goal.
Awesome. Okay, so now that we've kind of gotten that up front, the next thing I want to go theme in our show, like I kind of want to go into the nitty gritties of like a specific timeline of, let's pretend I was getting out of the Army in 6 months and I'm looking for a practice to acquire. When should I contact you? What would be the specific steps of once I found a practice that I like the numbers, and we've done a bunch of episodes on valuation. What are the steps that you're involved in versus that you would recommend us hiring someone else to take care of? The timeline of when do I reach out to you, and what are the specific steps of what you do in this transition versus what other professionals do?
I think that it's good to reach out to the lawyer initially and have an introductory. And most lawyers, and us included, don't charge for that introductory call.
Okay.
Get to know the person, make sure you're comfortable with them, and you've kind of decided that they're the person that you're going to hire, so that when it's time for them to actually provide services, they know who you are, and you've got that relationship that's already in the works. I think sometimes, and it's not the end of the world, but when people come to us and they say, well, I have a draft of an asset purchase agreement, can you help me? And this is the first time we meet them. Sure, we can, but there's some things that we may have done before to kind of set the table in a better way. Or now this person's scrambling around when there's a draft document out there where the other side is waiting for feedback. Now they're like into the marketplace trying to find you kind of add stress to yourself unnecessarily. And it's sort of, I think, as anything, when you're trying to make decisions in that setting, you oftentimes make bad decisions. So I think it's good to reach out to the lawyer initially, especially if it's somebody, or say, I'm getting close to identifying a practice that I think is going to work for me. Talk to the lawyer about the process, how they bill, what their fees are, all that stuff, what they're going to do. And so what we do with our clients is we say, okay, now as you move along, keep us posted with the negotiations. But that's the time that I think it's more critical for a good dental CPA to be involved. And that person's going to bring the due diligence, evaluating the practice, scrutinizing the selling broker's valuation of that practice.
All the due diligence of the numbers and the facts around that practice.
Exactly. And I also, if it's the right CPA, and it should be a dental specific person, just as we talk about the importance of a dental specific lawyer, same thing applies when it comes to CPAs and transitions. Work with people that do this and have done it, know what to look for, things that other people that aren't in this industry wouldn't necessarily see. So that person should really be uncovering the numbers. And the critical thing is I like for them to actually negotiate purchase price too, to some extent, because they have a handle on all the factors, the economic factors in the practice. So if the seller is asking, just say hypothetically, $750,000, the CPA for the buyer is looking at that. I think it's worth $750,000
in this market for these circumstances. Yeah,
exactly. Like the seller is accepting 30% of their patients are Medicaid. There's uncertainty now as to what's going to happen, risk associated with that, other factors that they have their finger on the pulse of. So it's a lot more effective, I think, from a negotiating standpoint in anything in life, whether we're talking about practice transitions or any kind of business where you negotiate from a position of knowledge and understanding. So I could get involved and negotiate a purchase price. Do I? Yeah, from time to time I do when I have to. But if you just say, hey, I want $750,000.
When we look for sponsors to the podcast, we look for sponsors that offer solutions to challenges we know our audience faces. One major challenge us young dentists and dental students face is the cost of education. The rising cost of education has left us graduating with a large amount of student loan debt, higher than any other industry. The average new grad graduates with $262,000 in student loan debt. We feel strongly that the best way to handle your student loan debt is to get into practice ownership and maximize your income as soon as possible. That is why at Shared Practices, we do everything we can to help navigate that pathway to successful practice ownership. After entering practice ownership, we recommend you turn your attention towards your student loans. Our recommendation is that you refinance your student loans to the lowest rate possible and then pay them off at whatever strategy you feel most comfortable with. That is why we brought Laurel Road as a sponsor to the podcast as our recommended solution for refinancing your student loans. Laurel Road, a division of Darien Rowan Bank, is a national leader in student loan lending. FDIC insured and established in 2006. Laurel Road has helped more than 20,000 professionals with graduate and undergraduate degrees across the country refinance federal and private school loans. Their average customer, not just dental graduate, saves more than $20,000 over the life of their loan after refinancing. Let Laurel Road help you leave debt behind so that you can stay focused on the road ahead. We asked the team at Laurel Road to create an informational website for our audience to understand the benefits of refinancing as it relates to us dentists. To learn more and discover your pre-approved rates, simply visit www.laurelroad.com/sharedpractices. Again, that is LAURELROAD.com/sharedpractices. Laurel Road is an equal housing and opportunity lender. All rates are subject to eligibility. Savings may vary. This is a paid promotion of student loan refinancing by Laurel Road.
That's probably more because they didn't hire someone that was truly competent. They probably had their friend who is a CPA who has nothing to do with dental, and they're kind of in a bind. And then you're like, okay, I can step in, but that's not maybe primarily what you'd be doing.
Right, that's very true. And it's still not nearly as effective, because if somebody's saying it should be $650 because of A, B, and C, then the seller says, oh, yeah, they might have come back and say $650. What's that based on, Rob? Well, I don't know.
Just feels good.
Throwing out numbers,
yeah.
Look, sometimes you have to do that, but that's far from the most effective way to try to negotiate.
So, and that's of some reasons why you'd want to kind of subdelegate all of these responsibilities and have professionals that know what they're doing within each subdomain. But going back to some specifics, you mentioned an asset purchase agreement. The same as a letter of intent or LOI, or is that different? And how is that different?
That's different. So when you're looking at a letter of intent, LOI or purchase proposal or offer letter, but commonly a letter to us. That should be a non-binding document that just sets forth sort of the big picture terms, the economics of the deal, and maybe some specifics. So it's going to say what the purchase price is, if the seller is going to stay on after the sale. You might say what the compensation is going to be, a few contingencies. It's kind of a bare bones, like this is the big picture stuff that we've agreed to.
So do you get involved on the LOI, or is that typically done before? So in my mind, like, let me explain to you how I think it works. And still, like, the ridiculous part of this podcast is I've never purchased a practice. I'm trying to figure all this out. So this is how I think it works. And you correct me where I'm wrong. So if someone were to find a practice that they think, okay, cursory looking at the numbers, and from what I understand, I think this is a good practice that I want to make an offer. I want to investigate further. I want to do the due diligence. So they put forth an LOI saying, I want to buy this. I want to attempt to find a price that we can agree on and do the due diligence. And so that it saves them a spot in line of like, we're going to attempt to buy this practice. And if someone else submits after them, they kind of, for the most part, have that spot first of like their ability to attempt to purchase the practice. And then the due diligence begins of like, here's all of the real documents, and you can have your PA looking at this, a consultant looking at this, maybe you've got a broker that's representing you that can be looking at this. And then after you've done all that due diligence, then you submit the asset purchase agreement, and that's more of a binding document. Is that how the whole timeline works? Varies state by state?
Somewhat. It varies deal to deal. It's not really necessarily state by state.
Okay.
So a lot of times, we like our clients to have done a significant amount of due diligence before we do the LOI. So if possible, we would want the CPA to have already done a good bit of their analysis and investigation into the practice before there's an LOI.
Okay.
And then the CPA would come back and say, yeah, this works at this. Let's write it up. So then we would get involved and help with the preparation of the LOI. And the LOI would also provide that there would be additional due diligence after that. But generally speaking, we like to have it done before we get to the LOI stage. So the LOI would say that the parties are going to then agree to enter into negotiations on the definitive binding contract, which is the purchase agreement.
So pre-LOI is like due diligence, and you should be able to get all the documents and we've talked about that in some episodes before, all the documents to really dig in deep and do that due diligence. LOI signifies the start of negotiation. Is that fair to say?
Yes, it is. So, backing up a few minutes ago, we talked about sort of what the process is. So we would meet with the client, discuss the process, basically send them to the CPA is going to do the valuation and the scrutiny and the due diligence. CPA comes back and says, this looks good at this number. We would then write that up in an LOI and present it to the seller. Sometimes the seller have already had discussions about the purchase price while the CPA is doing their due diligence. So sometimes it might just be a matter of memorializing that number in the LOI.
Okay.
Sometimes it might be the LOI might be the first time it's being thrown out. And that varies from deal to deal. So then after the LOI is signed, again, that's not a binding agreement. That's just a letter of intent, what it's exactly what it's called, which is we're intending to pursue a transaction. Then at that point, the actual definitive legal documents get prepared and negotiated.
Okay. So now that you're negotiating this asset purchase agreement, the whole document, correct? What are the things that people get hung up on and have trouble with that you guys can kind of, let's give here and let's hold fast here. This is important to us, or, this much of it is like numbers and financial issues versus things like non-competes and other agreements. So, what are the main things that you end up changing or negotiating around?
Yeah, there shouldn't be that of numbers at that point because that's the purpose of the LOI.
Sure.
To nail that down. So most of the stuff is more or less non-economic that we're talking about. LOIs, non-competes rather, are very important. We end up negotiating those. That's obviously, if you're buying a practice, you're buying the goodwill of the seller. The goodwill is only preserved in the practice if the seller can't take it with them.
They can't open shop down the road and bring all those patients back over to them.
Exactly. So that's an important thing. And when a seller tells you, "Hey, I'm looking to retire. I'm going to move to Phoenix and golf, and this is great, and I can't wait," and then you give them an asset purchase agreement, compete, and you're in, to say, Pittsburgh. And then they come back and say, "Well, we don't like 20 miles, we like 15. Well, wait a second. What about your house in Phoenix?
I thought you didn't care. I thought you were moving out.
Like this, what are your intentions here? So compete serves a couple of functions. I mean, one is the obvious, protect the goodwill of the practice. But two, it really fleshes out the true intentions of the seller. And sometimes people are, they don't a game plan to try to compete after the sale. Oftentimes we'll hear like, "Oh," the lawyer on the other side will say, "Well, he or she just wants to keep their options open." Oh, that doesn't really work for our buyer client. We're not paying all this.
We'd like to protect ourselves rather than giving them options of, "Oh, we don't want to be protected," or "We do want to be protected."
Exactly. The option is whether or not you want to sell your practice. Like once we pay for it, you have no options. That's it. Be able to walk away. So the non-competes are an important thing. And then, beyond that, every deal is different. Sometimes we have issues with not necessarily the seller, but with the landlord, where we're going to have to either or negotiate a new lease. And so, we have to negotiate that. And that part of the process sometimes could be as straightforward as a half hour of just going through the ministerial process of assigning the lease, or it could turn into itself where you have to go into a full-fledged lease negotiation.
Well, and I want to have you back for another episode on that specifically of lease negotiations and assuming that and the problems and opportunities that can with that process, and as well as the circumstance where you're buying the real estate outright, when you are also acquiring a practice. So we'll put a pin in that because I want to get you back, and I know you've got a lot of experience and a lot of you've done this over and over and over. So I want to hear your opinions on how to do that correctly. So it sounds like the non-compete, the real estate, those are kind of the main things that can hold this up at that point once the price is locked in. Is there any other kind of non-economic terms that you'd want to go into?
Depending on the deal, if the seller is going to remain on as an associate after the closing, you could have a negotiation. Well, you would on the form of employment agreement that they're. And while the economics of that employment agreement should be summarized in the LOI, there are usually a lot of things that haven't been discussed. So a lot of times there's negotiation on that. And a couple other quick things are, how accounts receivable is going to be handled, effective work is going to be handled.
Okay.
Some other non-economic things that are not as significant as the first few things we talked about, but certainly important as well.
Well, and I think we've talked about it on the show before, and we'll talk about it again. But the accounts receivable, someone brought up the fact that like if you're going to allow them to continue to collect the rest of their accounts receivable, aka for people not as familiar with that term, that's just money that's still owed to the practice that hasn't been collected yet, then you're going to have to allow them access and the data and your office so that they can contact those patients or, do whatever they need to do to get that money to come in. So sometimes it seems, in my mind, it seems a little cleaner to buy the accounts receivable, but that's just my preference. I think it kind of and the circumstances of the individual circumstance.
I agree. If you can buy the accounts receivable, that's best. And a lot of times sellers are willing to sell the accounts receivable at a discount and actually hold a note. So maybe the accounts receivable is purchased for 75% of the accounts receivable for 90 days and under, and then maybe it's repayable to the seller over a 12-month period. So the money's going to come in that you have to pay it, which actually helps with working capital.
Interesting. I'd never heard of that. Them holding a note. So that gives you, rather than having to pay them right at the closing for the potential accounts receivable at an even more extended rate than the rate that you're going to collect these accounts receivable.
Right. Yeah, and which helps with cash flow
Right up front.
I'm not a fan at all, Richard, of sellers collecting their own accounts receivable. And as you the litany of what that means, I sort of cringe, because that's just putting the seller in contact with the patients post-closing, which is bad. It's also potential for confusion if patients are getting bills from two different places.
Yeah.
And so, great. But even if you can't buy it, it's still better for the buyer to collect the seller's accounts receivable, because then you have control over the whole situation. The seller's not talking to the patients. You know how to apply the payments. Your staff has access to, obviously, all the accounting and bookkeeping, and you can track, what the balances are. It's a much cleaner thing. And in doing that, oftentimes parties will agree that the buyer can charge a percent of the accounts receivable as a fee for collecting that. So maybe 10% or so. And that's a much better way to go.
That's good to know. So if they refuse to sell the accounts receivable, you collect the accounts receivable on their behalf and kind of over time. And you can even sometimes charge a little fee for the time and effort your staff is going to have to put into that. So I didn't know that. So that's great. But first, a word from our sponsor, Q Optics. I've got with us here Brent Downs, who is the director of sales at Q Optics. And he's got a little bit of advice for that new dentist going to their first conference.
We'll call her the light bulb lady. This goes back to the early 90s. I was in a booth right next to her, and this lady was legendary in how she would attract people into her booth. And, the unsuspecting dentist, within a matter of just a few seconds, would have his bags on the ground and 2 light bulbs in his hands.
And we're talking like color-corrected ceiling lights or something?
Exactly. Exactly. And she was just a master at communicating, but she was also one of the most pesky sales reps that I've ever met in my life. It got to the point where she was around for years. People would see her walking down the aisle and they would literally turn around to avoid her. And it made for just a miserable experience for me.
Working next to her.
Exactly. I didn't have a whole lot of people to talk to that week. And the point is, the lesson that I learned from that is just, don't be afraid to say no. You're not going to hurt any feelings. It's just business, and they've got a job to do. Maybe they're a little bit aggressive in how they go about it, but you have to protect your self-interest. So no is a good thing to say.
It's a good little word to learn, and you're never going to hurt anyone's feelings just by learning a little bit and moving on.
Exactly.
Awesome. If you're ready to upgrade your magnification experience, send an email to sales@qoptics.com. using the promo code SP16 for $100 off a pair of loupes or $300 off a loupe and light combo. They will figure out who the rep in your area is and schedule a demo for you where you can get fitted, try them out, see for yourselves. In worst case scenario, you say no. Not a big deal. Q Optics. Have a better look.
Yeah. That's what we usually end up doing.
Okay. No, and that the last part of this to wrap this whole discussion up, and this has been great because this has provided some real specific details, which is what I love getting into on these podcasts. Where have you seen people get in trouble with acquisitions? So if people come to you, they probably avoid the kind of trouble I'm talking about, but where have people gotten into either a bad practice or the agreement and the terms that they agreed to were not in their favor, and maybe the fact with the contract and saying, hey, this is what I thought we had agreed upon, but now it's not working out. Do you have any specific examples of times where people didn't hire the right people, and it ended up biting them in the butt later on.
Yes. You said it doesn't happen, thankfully, and not surprisingly with our clients, because we get people in the right place in the right situation and make sure they're working with the right folks at the right time. But there are people that come to us after the fact with problems. There's one common theme with all these people. These are all people who have purchased practices where there was a dual agent representative, dual agent broker, who, somebody that's representing the seller as not just the broker, but then they also get involved with doing the valuation, advising the buyer and seller on the correct purchase price, and they also get involved with document preparation, as well as due diligence. The issues that we've seen over the last couple of years all have that one common thread. And this is something that we say repeatedly to people when we speak at study groups and to residency groups, and you absolutely have to avoid those people. If you are interested in a practice that is listed by a dual representative, a dual agent, then do what you need to do in that regard. But you still have your own lawyer and your own CPA to scrutinize the agreements and negotiate them, and to scrutinize the valuation and negotiate the purchase price.
Well, it seems like, so I'm trying to think of, from both a buyer and seller's perspective, you would agree to this dual representation. But if you're the seller, you're like, okay, I have this guy who's going to come in and do everything. They're going to take care of all of this. They're going to, wrap it up in a nice bow. They're going to list it. They're going to find someone, and then it's a streamlined process because they're also going to help the buyer. So the seller's like, okay, don't worry about this. I've got a guy who can take care of all of this for both of us. And I'm paying him, so you're not going to have to pay a bunch of extra people. And the buyer's like, okay, great. I don't have to hire anyone. This person's going to take care of the transaction. So they've put all of their eggs in that one basket, and the incentives don't line up with both the buyer and the seller and this one dual representing person doing everything. They can't masters faithfully and really be truly negotiating on behalf of both parties. Is that how it happens typically?
Absolutely. I mean, those people have one thing in mind. It's not necessarily the seller's best interest. They want to get the deal closed so they could collect their commission at all costs. So
it's kind of like the worst case fixed fee arrangement. It's like they're getting paid to get this job done. So the sooner the job gets done, the sooner they get paid, and then they can move on to the next one.
Absolutely. And it is the worst case scenario. And I think in that scenario, the buyer is the one that gets hurt the most, because the buyer is the one that needs the protection. The seller, for the most part in the deal, make sure that there's nothing in the agreement that can kind of come back to haunt you after the fact, and make sure the non-compete is consistent with your post-closing goals.
Sure.
From a buyer's perspective, there's so much more, and they're the ones that need somebody for them and to advise them. And you need somebody who is not looking out for the other side or themselves. You need a CPA or a lawyer that's going to say, Doc, this is a lousy deal. Don't do it. Yeah. And there's no broker, there's no dual agent representative that's going to tell a buyer that. Why would they? This is their livelihood. This is how they make money. So you have to really consider why this is not costing you anything. Why it's paid for and it's part of the transaction. And don't worry, it's free. It's free because you're not getting anything.
Right. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and this is definitely the circumstance.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, you can't serve two masters. Say with that is, how the example, which people that have heard me speak before will have heard this, but you can't have a pitcher in a Major League Baseball team pitch for both teams. They go into the dugout between innings and hey, give me the other uniform, but let me put my hat on. Okay, let me run back out. That, it doesn't work that way. And where that manifests itself in the dental world, especially if you think about non-competes, how could you possibly represent a buyer in the negotiation as to the appropriate scope of a non-compete? Do you say, well, I think it should be 5 years, 20 miles, and then run over to the other side of the table? Well, I only want to do 3 years and 10 miles. How can you? And that's one instance where somebody did come to us a few years ago where they had a lousy non-compete, where the seller was able to basically get back into the business 2 years after the sale, and all the patients, many patients exited the practice and went to the seller because the non-compete was never appropriate for the buyer. Another instance where we had a problem was, this was the classic jack of all trades. So this is, even though they weren't a dual representative broker in this deal, they commonly are. So they were supposedly a buyer broker.
Okay.
So they're supposedly acting as a consultant in that regard, and then negotiating the purchase price. We're doing the practice valuation, supposedly, or scrutinizing the seller's practice valuation. They were also negotiating the legal documents, and they were doing all this at a flat fee, Richard. So this is kind of like the perfect storm. So what ended up happening? Well, they didn't really spend much time on reviewing the documents. So there were some things in the documents that weren't great. There were representations that were not included in the document as to the amount of Medicaid that the practice accepted in there. The valuation, they didn't bother to scrutinize that same issue. And at the end of the day, the buyer ended up buying a practice that was 70% Medicaid when he thought it was only 20%. And, nobody captured that in the document. So it wasn't that we could come back now and say, hey, you misrepresented it.
Yeah.
It's because it was never done. So what I would say, in addition to avoiding the dual agent representation, that are jacks of all trades. A CPA should be doing the valuation. A lawyer should be doing the documents and negotiating those. You shouldn't have a CPA doing legal documents. You shouldn't have a lawyer doing practice. You shouldn't have a broker doing legal documents or valuations. Everybody should stay in their lane, do what their expertise is. The broker's expertise, what they bring to the table, they're putting a buyer and seller together.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah.
That's all they should. CPA, they're dealing with the numbers and the valuation, scrutinizing those and helping with the due diligence. The lawyer is making sure that what the CPA is relying on in connection with their due diligence gets captured in the document, so that if it turns out assumptions or things that were provided by the seller turn out not to be true, that the buyer has recourse. Everybody does their own job, and they're all experienced in their particular fields, and that's when you have good representation.
Perfect. Well, with that Medicaid example, did they end up overpaying because they thought they were buying way less Medicaid than they actually bought? Like, was it the price fair?
They overpaid by about a third.
Holy cow. Okay. So essential, having the right team that knows what they're doing, that does their part and communicates and is working on your behalf, rather than just trying to get this deal done so they can move on to the next one. They're getting a flat fee. And it goes back to this idea that most dentists aren't going to be doing many transitions in their life. They'll probably do maybe 1 or 2 acquisitions and maybe 1 or 2 sales. And so it's possible to if you don't have the right people with the right incentives working for you and working with you, rather than just trying to move along and do the next deal and get paid their flat fee. So this kind of brings it all together. I really appreciate you in that picture and helping us understand why this is so important. So thank you so much for being on the show.
That's a pleasure, Richard. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. We'll bring you back, and we're going to talk about real estate on the next one. I appreciate it, Rob. We'll talk to you later.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Okay. Interview. It's always tricky talking fees. And I think I wanted to get that out there as like, okay, how are we going to structure how a lawyer is paid? Because I've seen people get burned with other fee structures, specifically referred people that may or may not have been on the podcast. It's things can get tricky when money is involved anytime that happens. And so I wanted to kind of present an alternative fee structure and a way of hiring someone to help with an acquisition.
Rob did a great job of talking about why his fee structure or hourly fee structure is appropriate in deals. And I think what he said made a lot of sense to me. And it's funny, my current lawyer, I did the LOI for the practice that I'm going to buy, hopefully.
Yeah.
And I ramped it up. He was talking in the episode about, like, you talked about a picky buyer, and I was laughing to myself when I was listening to that, because I'm totally the picky buyer.
Oh yeah.
I mean, we had 4 revisions on the LOI before it was even sent to the seller. It was just me and my lawyer going back. And so I'm just,
That's
yeah.
so funny.
So my bill got ramped up a little bit, but I don't complain because I was happy with the result. But it's funny that you said that, and I think hourly is appropriate in that case. But that's all I'll say
I
about
did not
fees.
have you in mind. I wasn't like, if you had a really picky client like George, then it might take a few more revisions to get through everything. That was not with you in mind. So I liked that he talked about the LOI because the letter of intent, how I understood it, is kind of locking in that price. And then everything else kind of centers around that. It's like you've got this one fixed point, the price, that you're like, based on our due diligence, here we go. Now, what else do we need to take care of?
Yeah, I think it's great for people to get the idea of what is the workflow of a deal, and the LOI is, like you said, is all the financial information is fixed. But at that point, you need to do some due diligence. But the LOI gives the seller the peace of mind. Serious. There's an offer in place that they're willing to accept, and then you get the practice off the market officially. So then it's you enter a period of like 60 to 90 days where you have exclusive access to that listing. It's off the market, and then you'll do all. Pretty much what you're doing is you're verifying all of the information that you had beforehand to make that offer, and you are making sure that there are no big red flags, nothing that's going to be big to influence the deal. And the idea is that anything you find in due diligence be big enough of a deal to affect the purchase price, which is why it's all negotiated on the front end. And then you're just getting all of your stuff in place, like the non-compete, working out the accounts receivable, all of the small details to eventually sign a purchase agreement where you then. So that's usually done in 2 to 3 months.
Well, and this is kind of like the equivalent when you're buying a house of entering escrow. In that, it's no longer being listed and taking a bunch of offers. Like, the difference is, my friend asked me this the other day, like, you don't have to put money, like down payment, towards your escrow, do you, when you enter your LOI? And I feel like the time, the due diligence that you've done and paid for up to the LOI, and then that you're going to be doing once you're in negotiations, is kind of like the fact that you're taking this seriously, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I talk about a lot in the Ownership Accelerator in relation to brokers is that they're almost gatekeepers in a way, and a lot of that, in ensuring qualified buyers are the ones submitting offers, so that maybe a down payment isn't needed, because a lot of the sellers are relying on the broker to make sure that somebody who's serious is going to submit an offer and take it off market, versus somebody who's just shopping around, ready to buy a practice of that size or whatever it may be.
Like,
so I also think
George in his first year of dental school.
Exactly. They made sure that I did not look at these practices because I'm not a qualified buyer.
Exactly.
As a first year dental student when I tried contacting brokers.
So lame.
Yep. But that's I think that's why it's not a big deal in the dental deals.
Well, and I also liked how, you take it off the market, and now it's like, if you discover things that maybe weren't exactly what you thought they were going to be, rather than negotiating the price, you can negotiate accounts receivable, or, you have these other things that you can kind of use one way or another. Like, oh, we did our due diligence and found out this, and maybe you're not knocking off 50 grand. Okay, well, we didn't like this. We feel like this was misrepresented. What if we included the accounts receivable? And I feel like Derek did that, didn't he? Like, somehow did he buy it or just got the accounts receivable? I can't remember.
That was me. Yeah. I
Yeah.
asked the seller what price they wanted, and then I ultimately paid them that price. One of my favorite quotes is Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad Poor Dad guy.
Yeah.
It says, "Your price, my terms." And so that's something that I like to buy, where you really don't negotiate on price, but you negotiate on the terms.
Sure.
And so that's where the due diligence period comes in, and you can really debate on, what's important to the seller and what's not, and try to take advantage of those things that maybe are up for grabs.
Cool. Well, episode, and it dovetails right into the real estate side of things, which Rob is also an expert on. So we're going to have Rob back on the show. He's on the accelerator, phenomenal resource, very, very generous with his time and willing to help us out on the podcast. So having him on the show, and we'll have him back next week. Okay. We'll talk with you guys next time.